Thanks, everybody. Apologies in advance. This is going to be more dense and technical than the drumming talk. And it might be a little bit too dense for some of you, but feel free to ask questions. So it'll be my pleasure today to talk to you about mechanisms of metabolic bariatric surgery, particularly mechanisms of remission of diabetes. And I'll touch a little bit about how those mechanisms were instrumental in the development of the new obesity management medications that you guys are hearing so much about. It's my impression that the talk after this is Josh here. Josh, oh yeah. So it set the stage with Josh. He's going to tell you in spades about those medicines. Okay. So technical people, I don't have the forward button. So is this thing?
Yeah, you can
okay. No. Okay. Okay. So we'll try that. So I'm going to talk about four categories of things today. The first is to discuss these mechanisms of, in particular, diabetes remission, mechanisms beyond just weight loss after metabolic bariatric surgery. Whenever I say metabolic surgery, that's what you guys traditionally call bariatric surgery. It's been renamed in the field. And I will say right off the bat that in addition to weight loss as a promoter of improvement in diabetes, so through indirect mechanisms, there are many weight-independent mechanisms engaged by operations like gastric bypass. And the existence of those is important because it lays the foundation for why we should consider the use of these operations specifically as diabetes interventions to treat diabetes as the primary intent, including in lower BMI people who may not lose much weight after they undergo surgery. Then I'll move on to, based on those, that premise, diabetes-related randomized trials hitting directly surgical versus non-surgical approaches to diabetes against one another, as well as longer-term studies that are not randomized trials but have harder outcomes. And then based on the results of all those studies, close with some exciting new policy implications for the use of metabolic surgery. So let's start with these mechanisms of diabetes remission. So first of all, the stunning fact is that after people undergo most metabolic operations like gastric bypass, the large majority will enjoy remission of diabetes, and typically very fast before they've really lost very much weight. So how does it work? And that's how I got into this field. I'm not a surgeon, but I got into it in the hopes that if we could figure that out, it would identify drug targets that we could then try to capitalize some of the effects of surgery without the operations. And, you know, it was my dream that it would eventually lead to what became semaglutide. So how does it work? Well, obviously, you lose a lot of weight. And so, of course, you're going to improve your insulin sensitivity with that. And there's no question that insulin sensitivity does improve in all the major important organs like muscle and liver and the pancreas after metabolic surgery. And that, at the very least, helps consolidate the benefits on diabetes. But more important for this talk, several of us in the field, it's just largely a cohort of just half dozen or more people leading the charge, have found in the last 15 years a large series of additional mechanisms beyond weight loss that are weight-independent anti-diabetes mechanisms engaged by metabolic surgery. They include favorable changes in gut hormones, changes in bile acid signaling, gut microbiota, glucose transport in the gut, as well as glucose utilization by the gut, alterations in GI nutrient sensing in the proximal intestine to affect insulin sensitivity, and changes in iron metabolism that I'll get into. So let's talk about the first one, favorable changes in gut hormones, and that is the most relevant to Josh's talk to follow. So the first player here that got things started was ghrelin, the hunger hormone. And I was proud to be the first author on the paper that published that talked about that in the New England Journal a long time ago when my career was just starting. Ghrelin had just been discovered. We developed an assay to measure it and measured its levels in human subjects every half hour across the 24-hour period while they're eating and sleeping and so on, and found three things. This stomach hormone that's released that makes you feel hungry when it's released rises before every meal and falls as soon as you eat. That helped implicate ghrelin as the long-sought mediator of mealtime hunger. Number two, if you lose weight, like by dieting, that's the difference between the middle graph and the highest graph. The entire ghrelin profile rises in proportion to the amount of weight loss, and that later was shown to happen with exercise-induced weight loss, and other things, implicating ghrelin as one of the players in long-term body weight regulation. And in contrast, people who lost a ton of weight with gastric bypass had really low levels of ghrelin. And that implicated ghrelin as one of the mechanisms by which gastric bypass might reduce hunger. More importantly for this talk, ghrelin is pro-diabetic through many means it increases blood glucose levels. So compromised ghrelin secretion after metabolic surgery could contribute to an anti-diabetes effect. Now, as it's turned out, ghrelin, the actual role that plays in all the benefits of metabolic surgery is a bit player at best. But it did sort of have a historic role, a beneficial role, to get the field started thinking about the idea that things like gastric bypass are endocrine interventions. They don't just make your stomach smaller and do physical stuff. And that laid the groundwork for other things, such as the much more popular idea that some of the benefits come from enhanced GLP-1 secretion. This makes sense. GLP-1 is primarily secreted from L cells in the distal intestine, which their primary mode of stimulus is nutrients reaching the distal intestine and stimulating the release of several peptides from the L cells. They include oxyntomodulin, PYY, and GLP-1, all of which contribute to the making you feel full. They are satiety peptides. And then GLP among them also stimulates insulin secretion. So it makes sense that if you shortcut nutrients to get to the distal intestine in an accentuated way, you should hyperstimulate GLP-1 in the postprandial state. Now that's because, for example, gastric bypass skips a few feet of intestine, but probably more importantly, it takes the pylorus out of digestive continuity. So there's no longer that break on the flow of nutrients from the mouth to the ileum and colon, where most GLP-1 is made. So all of those, and in fact, GLP-1 secretion is enhanced tremendously after gastric bypass. These are from my own lab from very early data showing subjects before surgery eating a test meal, and then after surgery, in the after surgery of the purple guys, you can see that their postprandial GLP-1 secretion is enhanced by like 20-fold or 30-fold. It's a huge effect, and many others have shown that. So all of these peptides now, GLP-1, PYY, and oxyntomodulin, have been shown to be accentuated after gastric bypass. And among them, GLP-1 is associated with its expected effect to increase insulin secretion. So based on that model, several companies have tried to replicate the anatomy of surgery with non-surgical means. So these are things done by GI Windows and Magnemosis, or the company names. They use, for example, powerful magnets that are put in the top and the bottom part of your gut, and then they come together, create an anastomosis between the two of them over a short period of time. It's a sutureless hole that shortcuts nutrients from the top of your intestine to the bottom of the intestine to hyperstimulate GLP-1. And these are now in clinical trials. So it turns out that the mechanism of enhanced GLP-1 secretion after gastric bypass is not just as simple as this shortcut idea. That turns out to be an oversimplified view. But regardless of the mechanism, the finding is absolutely true. After gastric bypass, GLP-1 secretion is greatly accentuated, and with it, insulin secretion. So does that explain the whole story on why gastric bypass gets rid of diabetes right away? And the answer is no. This comes from many loss of function experiments in animals with genetic knockout experiments, like knocking out GLP-1 or its receptor, or in humans by getting rid of GLP-1 action through pharmaceuticals to take GLP-1 out of the equation. And those studies show that the GLP contribution is a minor player in terms of all the benefits of gastric bypass. It is, however, by the way, just going back here, if I can go back, I'll get that. It is, I'm told, though, a key player in having helped with the development of semaglutide, because at Novo Nordisk, the lead of their GLP-1 program, Lotte Knudsen, she tells me that for many years, she was leading their GLP-1 program back when it was liraglutide, and everybody around her was telling her to stop because nobody had ever developed an obesity drug, and that this was a behavioral problem. You can't solve it pharmacologically. It's never going to work. And Lotte says that she held the force against those people for 15 years, in part based on her knowledge or her understanding that GLP-1 accentuation was part of why bariatric surgery does its miracle. And even though it turns out it's only a small player, it did help her continue, and then that led to liraglutide and later semaglutide, and maybe Loto will get the Nobel Prize one day. Another favorable changes leading to improved diabetes have to do with changes in bile acids. So when I was a medical student, bile acids were something you secrete from your gallbladder to help you to digest your fats. In recent times, however, it's been shown that bile acids do a lot of other metabolic things. And I'm not going to drag you through all this, but they interact with lots of different receptors in different tissues to affect metabolism in ways that, if accentuated, especially in the distal intestine, that all does good things for diabetes, stimulating insulin secretion, sensitivity, insulin-independent glucose disposal, and even increasing energy expenditure to contribute to body weight loss. And all of this is accentuated after metabolic surgery. Another mechanism has to do with favorable changes in gut microbiome. These things, by the way, are not very druggable. That's why they haven't panned out to lead to any new drugs the way GLP-1 has, because GLP-1 is a single molecule. You can create an agonist to it. Now, there's no surprise that after gastric bypass or similar metabolic operations, your gut microbiome would change. The thing changes intestinal pH, osmolarity, bile acids, oxygen concentration, food composition, everything. It would be stunning if microbiome didn't change, and it does. Lots of people have shown after metabolic surgery, there are lots of changes in genuses and species of microbiota. The question is, do these contribute to the benefits of the operation? And the answer is yes. I think the most compelling evidence from that comes from a science-related paper done by a dear friend of mine at Harvard named B. Kaplan. These are fecal transplant experiments where you take an animal that has no gut microbiome. This is a germ-free animal. It's a mouse. And you transplant a microbiome into that animal by transplanting the poop of animals who've undergone gastric bypass or control animals that underwent a gastric bypass, but were put back together in normal as a sham operation. And the guys who get the poop and microbiome of post-gastric bypass donors lose weight compared to the control poop from the sham-operated animals. And that's been now looked at in several animal species and taken to humans as well, and it works there too. The next category has to do with changes in glucose transport in some of the parts of the intestine after gastric bypass. So that's a gastric bypass. One of the limbs here, called the alimentary limb, is food but no digestive juices. And then the gray limb is digestive juices but no food. So neither one of those contributes to absorption. However, it was thought traditionally that might not be true of the alimentary limb with regard to carbs. The traditional thought is that carbohydrates do get absorbed in the alimentary limb even without any biliopancreatic secretions in it because of salivary amylase and some amylase in your stomach. However, that was challenged in a landmark paper published in a Cell journal by François Poutou in France, and he very eloquently showed in rats, pigs, and humans, the alimentary limb actually doesn't, after gastric bypass, doesn't absorb any nutrients. In addition to that, it turns out the alimentary limb disposes of nutrients in a different way. This is a science paper from Nick Stylopoulos at Harvard, and I know you don't know what that shows, but it's a PET scan that shows that after gastric bypass, the alimentary limb becomes a major glucose disposal organ. It can't absorb glucose from your diet, so it doesn't contribute to blood sugar that way, but it gobbles up glucose from your blood, like the liver does. And so it becomes a glucose disposal unit, and in both mechanisms then helps lower blood glucose. The next mechanism I'm going to talk about of diabetes remission after metabolic surgery is one I'll go into detail in because this comes from my own work. It has to do with changes in nutrient sensing in the proximal intestine affecting insulin sensitivity. So the first studies were in rats. This was a collaboration with a dear friend of mine, Francesco Rubino. I've already mentioned him. We wanted to know, well, gastric bypass, it's got two major structural components. It makes your stomach small, and it bypasses a small stretch of intestine, the duodenum. Let's see what happens when you only do one of those, to see what components of its benefits come from that. So Francesco invented this operation. It's an experimental variant called the duodenal jejunal bypass. And as you can see, the stomach isn't perturbed. There's no reduction in gastric volume as there would be in a gastric bypass. But the same amount of proximal intestine as would be bypassed in a gastric bypass is skipped here. So food goes directly from the stomach to the proximal jejunum. And we found that in a rat model of diabetes, a couple of them, this operation substantially improves or eliminates diabetes with no weight loss. So that led to two popular hypotheses back then. They were called the distal and the proximal, or the lower and upper intestinal hypotheses. The lower hypothesis argued, well, just like with gastric bypass, if there's a shortcut of nutrients to get from your stomach to your distal intestine, they should hyperstimulate GLP-1, and that might help stimulate insulin secretion. And or is there something special about not having glucose in this proximal intestine? This works. Oops, can't do that. About not having glucose in this proximal intestine. To explore that, we compared the effects of this operation with an experimental variant, where we kept the distal intestinal shortcut as it was, but sabotaged the proximal intestinal bypass by allowing food also to go through the normal route through the pylorus. And in the animals, we showed that about 50% of their ingested nutrients went down each pathway. What we found was that on the left, that operation, duodenal jejunal bypass, substantially improved or eliminated diabetes in rat models. And if we sabotage the proximal intestinal shortcut, it eliminated all the benefits, no effect at all, even though the distal intestinal shortcut was still intact, as was the hyperstimulation of GLP-1. So encouraged by that rat paper, I got an R01 from the NIH to study this in humans, and I want to talk to you about those data. So we took people with obesity and diabetes, and we characterized their glucose homeostasis at several time points. One was at baseline. We did this with some fancy texts. One was a standardized meal tolerance test to characterize gut peptide secretion. A frequently sampled IV glucose tolerance test, which quantifies insulin secretion, and a hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp study, which quantifies as the gold standard for looking at insulin sensitivity. So all that's done at baseline when the people have obesity and presumably insulin resistance. Then they have a gastric bypass. And for 2 weeks, they normally, which means that food skips that proximal intestine, the duodenum. And then we repeat all the studies. And we know clinically, most people are getting much better in their diabetes by this time. And so we'll learn, is this because of improved insulin secretion, sensitivity, or both? Then the key part of the experiment, in this, we get rid of the proximal intestinal bypass by feeding food also through a G tube placed in the excluded stomach at the time of surgery, which feeds food back through that excluded duodenum, getting rid of duodenal exclusion. They eat like that for 2 weeks, and then we repeat all the studies again and see, does this compromise the benefits that we saw at 2 weeks? And if so, is it secretion sensitivity both? And finally, we remove the G tube, reestablish duodenal nutrient exclusion, and 2 weeks later, repeat all the study to control for the passage of time. So in a nutshell, each subject is studied 4 times with a very deep characterization of their glucose homeostasis picture at baseline, and then with duodenal nutrient exclusion, nutrient passage again, and exclusion again. 2 main control systems. We didn't want changes in diabetes-related drugs to confound us here, because that would really screw us up, and people often change their drugs right after surgery. So we had to wash everybody away from their drugs for a couple of weeks before they started, and they weren't allowed to be on any diabetes drugs throughout the whole study. And if anybody's blood glucose went too high, we lost them. From the study. In addition, my default speaker has changed. Okay. I don't know what that means, but I'm being told something. We didn't want changes in body weight to confound things. And so we tried our best to keep people at a stable body weight. We put them on a 1,200 calorie day diet for 3 months before the operation and maintained them on the same diet for the duration of the experiment afterwards, with the exception of a couple post-operative days, begging and pleading with them, please try not to lose weight for the duration of our study. So here's our main finding. This is the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp assessment of diabetes sensitivity, of insulin sensitivity. Now at baseline, that's a low number. Then they have gastric bypass that creates a duodenal nutrient exclusion from nutrients. 2 weeks later, boom, they've got a tripling of insulin sensitivity. And we were successful at preventing weight loss. So this is before any weight loss has occurred, already tripling insulin sensitivity. Now in the third part, we reestablished duodenal nutrient passage, and boom, 2 weeks later, all the benefits gone. That despite the fact that by time point 3, people had actually begun to lose a little body weight despite our best efforts to prevent that. And that should, if anything, have increased their insulin sensitivity. Now we remove the G-tube, reestablish duodenal nutrient exclusion, and all the benefit comes back again and with remorse. So you have this high amplitude increase and decrease of insulin sensitivity solely dependent on whether nutrients are or are not passing through the duodenum independent of weight, strongly implicating duodenal nutrient passage as an influencer insulin sensitivity independent of body weight. Now that was pretty heretic as the first proposal because people think of the gut's role in glucose homeostasis as the incretin effect and in stimulating insulin secretion. But we weren't the only people talking about that. So novel roles of gut to regulate insulin sensitivity have been proposed by others. This is a paper articulating that in Nature by Wang et al. He and she, I'm not actually sure if it's a he or she, characterized a pathway by which nutrient sensing in the proximal intestine activates a neural mechanism that fires up to the hindbrain and then back down through the efferent vagus to the liver to affect insulin sensitivity in the liver through a neural pathway. Separately, Geltrude Mangroni in Italy, an excellent scientist, identified a humoral pathway affecting muscle. So this is the canonical insulin signaling pathway in muscle. Geltrude found that secreted proteins from the upper intestine of rats with diabetes, but not without, and mice with diabetes, but not without, engaged some sort of intracellular pathway involving mTOR, which gummed up the signaling of insulin by serine phosphorylating AKT and preventing it from being properly phosphorylated the way it should be in the insulin signaling pathway. So in a nutshell, there's one pathway involving a neural mechanism going from the proximal intestine to the liver to affect insulin sensitivity, and the other one, a humoral pathway involving secreted proteins from the proximal intestine acting on the muscle, either which or both could explain our finding. So based on all these findings, that has established the model for the business plan for some drug companies, some device companies, Fractal and Energetics among them, who are arguing that, well, we and many others argue that the proximal intestine seems to secrete one or more pro-diabetic factors in the diabetic state. And if we can neutralize those, that will help confer an anti-diabetic effect. So one of the ways to do that is just ablate the duodenal mucosa with various techniques, thermal ablation, irreversible electroporation. And the new duodenum that grows back seems to be healthier. And these are being explored now as means to treat diabetes already on the market in Europe, for example. You can also get the same effect by just creating that duodenal nutrient exclusion with a endoscopically placed sleeve in the proximal intestine. This is being pursued by many companies, the most far along is GI Dynamics, and their proximal intestinal sleeves that create a bypass like a gastric bypass substantially improves glucose homeostasis in several rat models as well as in humans. And GI Dynamics has just restored its permission to start selling this clinically in Europe. They lost it for a while because of safety issues that they've now licked. This was a paper published in one of the Nature journals a while ago, but now carried forth to human trials. It's a pill that creates a duodenal nutrient exclusion with a special biomaterial. It gets to the stomach, gets released, and forms a kind of a film on the proximal intestine and isolates it from contact with ingested nutrients to create the same effect. And this is now in early human trials for a diabetes agent. The last thing I think I'll just skip over, this is favorable changes in iron metabolism. Iron, you don't think it has anything to do with glucose homeostasis, but Randy Seeley's group has shown that acting through the HIF2 alpha transcription factor, which is a pleiotropic thing, it has many effects on glucose and energy homeostasis in ways that are benefited after gastric bypass or other metabolic operations like sleep gastrectomy. And there are probably some unknown mechanisms we have yet to discuss. So are these weight-independent anti-diabetes mechanisms really important? Or are they just bit players? Well, I'm going to provide some evidence from one of my own studies that suggests they're important. This comes from our COSMID randomized trial, a randomized controlled trial of gastric bypass versus optimal medical lifestyle care for diabetes in people of Asian Indian descent, South Asian descent, with BMIs down to 25. So people randomly allocated to get gastric bypass had much better glucose lowering than those who got an aggressive medical lifestyle program throughout the 2 years of this study. We wanted to ask the question, was this because they lost some weight, or were the weight independent effects important? So we just said, well, let's look at the people who lost more weight versus the people who lost less weight. And traditionally, if you start out with a heavier weight, you lose more than if you start at a lower weight and you have gastric bypass. So we subdivided our group into those who were above or below the median weight at the beginning, expecting them to have different amounts of weight loss. And that was true. So what we saw was the open squares, dotted lines, are the people in the lighter half of our study group, and they lost less weight than the people with the heavier half of our cohort. And it was a big difference. So the heavier half lost 35% of body weight, the lighter half only lost 15%. Question is, if weight loss was the dominant determinant of their improvement in A1C, then it should be more A1C reduction in the people who lost more weight. Was that true? No, not at all. The A1Cs were identical between the two groups throughout the 2 years, and as were the medication uses for diabetes, despite a huge difference in the amount of weight loss, suggesting to me, or at least consistent with the idea that these weight-independent anti-diabetes mechanisms engaged by gastric bypass are not just fit players, but heavy actors. So pivoting now, the question of where does this put us in terms of where metabolic bariatric surgery fits in diabetes care now, including in people with only mild diabetes, mild obesity. So the position of bariatric surgery historically has been dictated by an ancient NIH consensus conference done in 1991, which limits it to people with severe obesity, meaning a BMI over 40, or moderate obesity, like over 35, with a complication like diabetes. And despite the many flaws in this system, it has allowed us to study at least that population for a long time. And from lots of clinical evidence and clinical data, we can say that metabolic surgery is terrific for this population. And it's hell on wheels against diabetes. Despite that, until just recently, you'd never see anything about metabolic bariatric surgery mentioned anywhere in any of the popular algorithms for how to treat diabetes that get put out every year by the ADS. It's because until recently, there was almost no level 1 evidence, meaning from a randomized trial, directly comparing surgical versus non-surgical approaches to diabetes. Such studies are hard to do. Imagine yourself as a possible study participant. You're going to choose between a major operation or plugging away with diet, exercise, and pills. You know, most people have an opinion on that. They're not willing to be randomized into treatment arms that are so divergent. Despite those Herculean operational challenges, however, the field has come together and answered the question. This is a list of the 13 randomized trials now published. 2 of them were directed by me, one I just showed you and another one, and the rest by the rest of the field, looking at various different metabolic operations compared to various different medical lifestyle interventions, some of them very aggressive. And you can see from the right-hand column that in all cases, surgery won over medicines and lifestyle for the degree of the diabetes improvement. I like this graph because we've organized it in the order of ascending baseline BMI of the study groups, from the lightest groups at the top to the heaviest at the bottom. The breakpoint between those with an average BMI starting above or below 35 is there. That's the usual threshold for their candidacy for surgery. You can see the data are no different. So that represents what we call level 1A evidence, meaning a meta-analysis of only randomized trials showing the degree to which metabolic surgery is better than any known medical lifestyle intervention for diabetes improvement is equally valid whether your BMI starts above or below 35, seriously calling into question the use of that arbitrary number as a surgical criteria. So from those those 13 RCTs, we can say that metabolic surgery is more effective than any known medical lifestyle intervention to date for weight loss, glycemic control, especially diabetes remission, improvement in other cardiovascular risk factors, with acceptable complications for at least 10 years at the time we put that graph together, and including in people with a BMI less than 35. Adding to that, this is some data from our ARMS consortium. This is a trial I've been involved in for many years now. It's the largest group of people with the longest follow-up ever among people who've been randomly allocated to get metabolic surgery or aggressive medical lifestyle care. And from our JAMA paper published last year, This is one figure showing 12-year data at the time. We now have 15-year data demonstrating that surgery people did much better than the medical lifestyle people for that whole time, despite the fact this was an intention to treat analysis, and a quarter of the people in the medical lifestyle group crossed over into surgery, and their benefits from surgery are counted in the medical lifestyle group. In terms of remission of diabetes, this is from a paper I'm directing and is currently under review with data out to 15 years. You can see remission after metabolic surgery was hands down more effective than after medical lifestyle, achieved in 60% of surgery and almost nobody in medical lifestyle. So the trouble with all these great data about metabolic surgery on diabetes is that glycemic control will die here now because their glucose is too high. They die because of the long-term effects of having high glucose. So let's look now at some non-randomized studies that look at harder endpoints. These are associations. So for example, looking at microvascular disease, here's a matched cohort trial that's exemplary, example done by my colleague in Seattle, David Arterburn, looking at folks who underwent metabolic surgery versus matched controls who did not. And you can see that those with surgery had about half as many microvascular disease events. That would be nephropathy, neuropathy, and retinopathy, each of which was statistically significant. And that's one of about 15 papers showing roughly a 50% reduction in microvascular events after metabolic surgery compared to matched controls or dark. How about macrovascular events? That's heart attacks and strokes. Again, from David Arterburn, my colleague in Seattle, this published in JAMA. He looked at 20,000 patients now who either had metabolic surgery in orange or didn't have it in blue and were exquisitely well matched for everything that would affect mortality. Those who had surgery enjoyed a 45% reduction in their heart attack rate. They had 52% fewer strokes. Put those together, you get 48% reduction in overall cardiovascular events. And then in terms of mortality, a stunning reduction of 70%. The added benefit on mortality coming from reductions in cancers. That's one of at least half a dozen similar papers that have all shown the same thing, probably more like 10. Let's hone in on this question about mortality as the ultimate hard endpoint. And I will show you data from a paper that I have the privilege of being the shared first author on, published a while back in Lancet. So this was a meta-analysis of folks who'd had metabolic surgery compared with very well-matched controls, exquisitely well-matched on a very high-level standard to match for anything that could affect mortality. The strength of the study is it's big, almost 175,000 patients studied for 1.2 million patient years and a total of up to 30 years of follow-up. As you can see in this Kaplan-Meier plot, those who underwent surgery enjoyed a survival benefit compared to the matched controls who didn't have surgery that was declared as early as 1 year in this study and just got bigger and bigger and bigger out to 30 years. So the longevity benefit was about almost 10 years if you had diabetes and had surgery. And if you didn't have diabetes, surgery gave you about 6 years of life. We show that in this paper, each 1% increase in the utilization of metabolic surgery worldwide would save about 12 million patient years of life. So in most developed nations, the actual use of surgery among people who qualify is about 1%. So if we simply took that to 2%, it would save about 12 million people next year and another 12 the year after that, and so on. I submit that we now have plenty of evidence from relevant randomized trials and large long-term prospective studies to inform policy. And that's been the goal of one of the projects that I've been involved in for a long time, about 20 years now, called the Diabetes Surgery Summit's kind of array of initiatives. Among the many things we've done over the years, one was to try to expand the indications for metabolic surgery to lower BMIs among people with diabetes, basically to treat it as diabetes surgery. And the group has advocated with high consensus that metabolic surgery can now be used in people with a BMI as low as 30 or 27.5 for Asians in the case of diabetes. That may not seem like a very big numerical change to drop from 35 to 30, but it includes a lot of people. And I estimate about 400 million people in the world with these criteria would qualify for metabolic surgery as an option who would not be able to qualify by the old NIH standards. They would qualify, that is to say, if this gets adopted. So how are we doing that? Here's the red countries I'm about to show you are the countries that have adopted as their national policies Diabetes Surgery Summit policies instead of NIH 1991 or something similar. Bless their heart, the first was Singapore, then Saudi Arabia, then big ones, India, China, Taiwan, Australia, United Kingdom. You can hardly see this. Chile, Argentina, Brazil, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong. How about the US? It's harder to change policy there because we have so many different insurance companies, but we are making progress. So far, United Healthcare, the largest health insurer in the world, has changed its criteria for surgery to include DSS criteria instead of the old NIH stuff. Medicare and Medicaid are actively pursuing this and considering it. For me personally, this is an important thing. The entire VA system, all national VAs and all Department of Defense hospitals now use as their criteria for metabolic surgery, Diabetes Surgery Summit criteria, not the old ones. And so even, as a practitioner, if I have some Asian guy with a BMI of 28 and terrible diabetes who's not doing well on medicines, I can send him to metabolic surgery as an option. Despite all this evidence and policy change, actual use of metabolic bariatric surgery remains low and stagnant, a very frustrating thing for those of us who spend a lot of our careers trying to develop evidence. So, and this is another Diabetes Surgery Summit project. We looked in 44 countries at the use of metabolic surgery among people who qualify. And it's about 0.96% in the United States of people who qualify for surgery who actually have it, and a little bit less than that in all these other 44 countries we looked at. And these are all very well-developed nations. If you look at, developing nations, it's virtually zero. So frustrated by that, and the numbers aren't changing at all. If anything, they're going down a little bit now with the new GLP-1 meds. So we convened a consensus conference to try to identify barriers to uptake of metabolic surgery and identified many things, but among them, we published a paper here in Nature Medicine identifying that entrenched obesity stigma continues to be a problem, keeping patients in need away from any interventions, whether it be surgery or medicines. And we published a big tome on means to try to reduce obesity stigma. We were pleased that this was published in Nature Medicine and formally endorsed by more than 100 medical, scientific, academic, and political organizations, as well as journals. Whether this academic effort, as well accepted as it's been in the ivory tower, is going to affect things out there on the ground, I don't really know. So in the course of my career, I've had the pleasure of working with many talented people at the University of Washington and many cherished colleagues throughout the world. I thank them for their work, and I thank you for all your kind attention.
I'm going to have to see, turn around, you can stand by the mic. Don't look at the screen, I'm going to change the slides. Can I stop sharing?
My questions have to do with rates of failure on surgery. People gain all that weight back today, and also gain all the complications and things like that. Is that maybe possible?
So there's a lot of definitions for failure of surgery. We talk about primary failure where it didn't do anything at all in the first place, and secondary failure where you lost some weight, had some benefits, and then they came back. I think probably you're thinking about secondary failure. So for example, a person loses a ton of weight and now gains it back. That is one of the most devilish challenges in the field. It is certainly a minority. Most people lose their weight. So the average is about a third of body weight loss, dating in about a year or a year and a half. And then between then and 5 years, most people regain a little bit and end up at about minus 28% from where they started. And the longest trial now goes out to more than 30 years. That's SOS, and that shows just a flat line out to 30 years. However, within that average, there are individuals who regain it all. And there are many, and predicting who they are is almost impossible. There are various strategies to correct it. You can do a more strong operation, go from the biggest operation failure was gastric banding, because that gastric banding sucks. So But beyond that, if you failed on a sleeve gastrectomy, you can advance it to a gastric bypass. If you failed on a gastric bypass, you could take it to a duodenal switch or something stronger. Or these days, add the new medicines. Anti-obesity medicines or obesity management medications work on top of metabolic surgery to augment its benefits, and that's been shown for semaglutide, tirzepatide, and some of the older drugs as well. And there's an increasing enthusiasm in the field of bariatric surgery and endoscopy to embrace combination therapies in the way oncologists do, which they, until a year ago, they were scared they were going to lose their jobs because of these great new drugs. I'm trying to get them to say, accept the great new drugs as an added tool in your armamentarium and use them the way in cancer people use surgery and chemotherapy and radiation therapy to benefit patients. And I was pleased just in the past few weeks, 2 large conferences that I went to of surgical organizations, their subtitles of their annual meetings were combo therapies, the dawn of a new era. And they, I gave 9 talks in one of them. I'm not a surgeon, but they wanted to hear all about how to use medicines for just what you asked about.
I guess that's a good segue. My question was, are all weight loss therapies created equal? Would you recommend a gastric sleeve or other surgeries over or around?
Oh, they're not all equal for sure. So there's a rank order in terms of effectiveness. As I said, gastric banding is terrible. So that's the weakest. But among things that people actually do, it would go sleeve gastrectomy, then stronger is gastric bypass, stronger still duodenal to a switch, or CDS or some other rare ones you haven't heard of. And that's pretty much the reverse order of hazard as well and complications. So sleeve gastrectomy is the least effective, but also the safest. Although safety here is like nuances, the difference between sleeve and gastric bypass. Each one of them has a mortality rate substantially better than cholecystectomy or appendectomy. Not a fair comparison because some people are sick as hell when they have their operations to take their gallbladder out or their appendix because they've just blown one of them. But they're about the same as the chance of dying from your knee operation or elective hysterectomy, which nobody considers them being. But yes, there's a rank order of the strengths.
I was curious on barriers for getting forward metabolic surgery.
Getting what?
Barriers. I was
Barriers.
looking into more of like who's successful, like you find to do for surgery. I think last I checked with him, so it was like 6 months monthly visits. With specifically LB and or obesity, but then also on top of being doing checks to make sure that it was free for another time. Then what things you have possible barriers for getting for surgery completed.
A very valid point. So most surgeons do require them to be tobacco-free for 3 months because the most common side effect after metabolic surgery is deep venous thrombosis and pulmonary embolism, and they're greatly accentuated if you're smoking. So that is a barrier for smokers. There are fewer and fewer smokers in much of the world nowadays. The barriers you talked about are things that we in the field think are ridiculous. 6 months of this or that, or you need to lose a certain amount of weight with diet and exercise before you can have surgery. 10-year outcomes between people who've had a big behavioral program beforehand and lost a lot of weight and not are indifferent at 10 years. So we consider those just insurance company barriers. The insurance companies that throw those up are stupid because metabolic bariatric surgery is not only cost effective in terms of cost per quality adjusted life year, it's cost saving on a business model over time if you live long enough. And the time to return on investment after a gastric bypass or sleeve is about 3 to 5 years if you have diabetes, and only about 9 years in the longest estimate. Most people live longer than that. And so after that, the insurance company will begin to recoup its losses and gain money. The reason they don't is because most Americans don't stay on insurance companies' plans more than 3 years. So if Alina Health does your gastric bypass, Kaiser benefits from it, and vice versa. They should all get together and everybody does more surgery, and then everybody would benefit, but they're not that wise.
Question. Great talk about your comments as always. I have, as a dietitian, I was former bariatric dietitian. I've been involved in over 5 wrongful death cases associated with very poor nutrition status after bariatric surgery. And so, I really think that we do need these procedures, but I'm curious about these novel therapies that, whether you're bypassing the duodenum or you're doing these, through and wise. I mean, you do bypass a lot of nutrient uptake areas from the duodenum, especially from, some of your minerals. What are the nutrition implications for these novel therapies? And then could you speak to the nutritional deficiencies associated after bariatric surgery?
Sure. First of all, the standard operations that we usually think about, gastric bypass and sleeve hysterectomy, neither one of them, and I'm talking about proximal gastric bypass, the usual one, are not gross malabsorptive procedures if done properly. In other words, you won't have alterations in albumin or globulin or coag factors or any of those indices of overall calorie or protein malnutrition. There are micronutrient deficiencies, as you correctly point out, especially in micronutrients that are preferentially absorbed in the proximal intestine, like iron and folate. And everybody's got vitamin D deficiency. So if you even bypass a little bit of intestine, you make that worse. So it is important to take supplements. And there are powerful vitamins that are prescribed for everybody who's had metabolic surgery, bariatric multivitamins, calcium and vitamin D, and for the first 6 months, protein supplements that everybody should have. Some of the experimental operations I talked about, none of those cause malabsorption either. However, there are, in answer to your question, Sean, I forget, some of the sort of stronger operations that are even more powerful than gastric bypass, like biliopancreatic diversion, those do cause malabsorption. They're purposeful malabsorptive procedures, and they cause a ton of weight loss, and they get rid of diabetes in almost every case, but at the cost of malabsorptive stuff because they create a shortcut syndrome. I don't advocate those unless you've got people with extreme obesity where the risk-benefit analysis justifies them. Let's say your BMI is 90. Maybe I think shortcut syndrome is better than staying with a BMI 90. But you have to be BMI well over 50 to start thinking about those more aggressive procedures.